All right, so get ready for this deep dive because we are heading into some pretty unexpected territory today. You wanted to explore some philosophical objections to Zionism,
Yeah.
and, well, we found a perspective that's, let's just say, not who you'd think of right away.
Right.
We're talking about Rudolf Steiner.
Yeah, definitely not the first name that comes to mind.
Mm-hmm.
Most people know him for his, spiritual teachings
Right.
or his educational philosophies. He wasn't exactly known for like diving into politics.
Exactly. But this is where things get interesting. Back in the late 19th century, when the Zionist movement was just starting to gain some traction, Steiner was completely against a Jewish state.
Hmm.
But, and this is important, not for the reasons that people might assume.
Yeah, you're right. It wasn't about like prejudice against Jewish people or anything like that. Steiner's whole stance came from this like really strong belief in individual freedom. That was like the foundation of his whole philosophy, really.
Okay. So set the stage for us. It's 1897. The Zionist Congress is meeting in Basel.
Right.
And there's this growing movement. People are calling for a Jewish state in Palestine.
Mm.
And then you have Steiner, who basically steps in and is like, whoa, hold on a second. This is a terrible idea.
Yeah, and he really wasn't afraid to, make his opinion known. He directly challenged the Zionist Congress in his essay, The Longing of the Jews for Palestine.
So he really felt strongly about this.
There you
But
go.
what was at the core of his argument? Why did he see a Jewish state as being like a step backwards?
So it all goes back to Steiner's whole thing about individual freedom
Mhm.
and how that played into his view of ethnonationalism.
Mm.
For people who aren't familiar with that term,
Yeah.
it's this idea that a nation is like defined by a shared ethnicity.
Okay.
And it usually goes along with this belief that this shared ethnicity, they should have their own independent state.
Right.
But Steiner thought that tying your identity so closely to your ethnicity, your religion, your nationality, whatever it was,
Yeah.
he thought that was incredibly limiting.
Interesting.
He believed that real progress, true progress, happened when people could move beyond those labels and, be guided by reason, by personal morals. To him, ethno-nationalism was the opposite of that progress.
So you're saying that creating a state that's based on ethnicity, even if it's intended to be like a safe haven, that actually reinforces those divisions between people instead of bridging them.
Yeah, exactly. He thought it would just make the gap bigger
Okay.
and lead to more conflict, not less.
Mm-hmm.
He saw it as like a really outdated, restrictive way of looking at society and civic identity.
Okay, I can follow that. But I have to ask, was Steiner anti-Semitic?
Right, and that's an important question to address head on.
Yeah.
And the material we have is very clear on that point. Steiner was careful to differentiate between criticizing a political ideology
Right.
and, actually hating a group of people.
Mm.
His problem was with the idea of Zionism, not with Jewish people themselves.
Which is a crucial distinction to make.
Oh, absolutely.
Because if we don't make that distinction, then we're not really engaging with the heart of his argument.
Exactly.
So just to be clear, he wasn't saying that anti-Semitism wasn't a real thing.
Right.
It was more like he thought that giving in to the pressure of anti-Semitism by creating this separate state, that was actually more damaging in the long run to the idea of, a shared humanity.
Yeah, and that's actually where Steiner says something really provocative.
Okay.
He said that anti-Semitism, while definitely a problem, was harmless compared to the dangers he saw in Zionism.
Wow. That's definitely a statement that's going to make people stop and think. How did he square that with, the very real persecution that Jewish people were facing at the time?
It goes back to his core belief in individual freedom being the pathway to true progress, right?
Right.
So he saw anti-Semitism as like a symptom of ignorance, prejudice, things that could be overcome through education, understanding.
Okay.
Whereas Zionism, to him, was almost like saying, okay, we give up, we're just going to separate ourselves.
So he felt that by creating this Jewish state, it was almost like solidifying the divisions that anti-Semitism thrives on.
Exactly.
And that ultimately it was actually hindering the potential for a more integrated, equitable society.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And to dig into this a little deeper, we should look at Steiner's book, The Philosophy of Freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Give me the elevator pitch. What's the main idea there?
Okay, so the philosophy of freedom really gets into Steiner's belief that true freedom, it's not just about external stuff. It's about this like inner development.
Right.
It's about really cultivating your own individual abilities, your reason, your moral compass, and becoming, the best version of yourself.
Yeah.
And the key thing is he believed you could do this regardless of your circumstances, like where you were born, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And
Oh,
that ties directly back to his opposition to Zionism. He felt that by creating a state based on ethnicity, it was limiting that potential for individuals to really flourish
okay.
because it just reinforces these like predetermined identities, you know?
Right.
It's like saying your most important identity is being Jewish and this is where you belong, instead of encouraging people to like, forge their own paths and contribute their own unique talents to the world.
So it's like he was advocating for a world where those labels become less important. And what really matters is your character, your intellect, the impact you have, not your background.
Exactly. He imagined a world where those external labels become secondary. And it's not that he didn't see the value in cultural heritage, of course,
Right.
but he believed that ultimately we should be striving for a reality where a person's worth wasn't defined by it.
Okay, so if creating a separate state wasn't the answer in his mind, what did he propose instead? Like, what was his alternative for Jewish people and for humanity as a whole?
He admitted that he didn't have all the answers, but he did believe that the best path forward was fostering like real understanding and collaboration between people.
Okay.
Imagine a world where things like mutual respect, moral development, and obviously freedom were prioritized. Essentially, a world where these shared human values were more important than any differences in, ethnicity, religion, where you're from.
So it sounds like he was kind of striving for this utopia where all those divisions would eventually just fade away.
In a way, yeah.
I can see how some people, especially at that time, with everything going on, might see that as a little naive.
Definitely an idealistic vision. And you're right, the historical context is so important here.
Right.
It's not like Steiner was unaware of the suffering and discrimination that Jewish people were facing.
Right.
But he truly believed that creating separate communities just wasn't the answer.
Yeah.
He really felt strongly that we had to focus on our shared humanity as the way forward.
So it's like he was saying, look, I know there's darkness and hatred in the world, but we don't have to let it define us. We have to strive for something better, not by isolating ourselves, but by, building those bridges of understanding and connection.
Yes, exactly. And honestly, that message feels like incredibly relevant even today, don't you think? Like in a world that can feel so divided,
Yeah.
Steiner's emphasis on unity and understanding, on recognizing the inherent value of each person, it's pretty powerful.
It is, but I'm sure this vision wasn't without its critics. What kind of pushback did Steiner get?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, his views, especially on Zionism, they weren't exactly met with open arms by everyone.
Yeah.
A lot of people accused him of being out of touch,
Mhm.
of not really getting the day-to-day realities that Jewish people faced.
Right. And I'm sure some people felt like, well, it's not really his place to say what's best for the Jewish community.
Oh, absolutely. That was a big part of the criticism, too. And, those are all valid points to consider.
Right.
But even with all the controversy, Steiner really stuck to his guns.
Yeah.
He never wavered in his belief in the importance of moving beyond those limiting labels that he thought divided us.
It's really something, Steiner had this incredibly optimistic outlook on human potential,
Yeah.
but he was still able to acknowledge the reality of prejudice, and just how divided the world was.
Right.
He didn't shy away from that at all.
That's what's so fascinating about his perspective. Even if you don't necessarily agree with every conclusion he came to,
Yeah.
he really forces us to confront these big questions, these really fundamental questions about identity, about freedom, and what it actually takes to create a society that's truly just and equitable.
So, as we start to wrap up this deep dive into Rudolf Steiner's views on Zionism, what would you say is the most important thing for our listeners to take away from all of this?
I think the biggest takeaway, the thing I hope people really think about is, just how important it is to engage with different perspectives.
Okay.
Even the ones that, challenge us
Yeah.
or make us feel a little uncomfortable. Steiner's whole take on Zionism coming from this place of like deep, deep belief in individual freedom and his rejection of ethnonationalism.
Right.
It really gives us a totally different lens to view this issue through,
That's true.
which is, let's face it, a really complex issue.
Right.
And, something people have very strong opinions about.
Yeah, for sure. It reminds us that there really are many sides to every story, and sometimes that perspective that you least expect,
Right.
that's the one that really gets you thinking.
Absolutely. And you know what? Regardless of whether you agree with his conclusions or not, Steiner's arguments, they really force you to look inward, you know?
Yeah.
They make you examine your own beliefs about identity, about belonging, even the role that the state should play in our lives.
Interesting.
He's asking us to consider, like, what's more important?
Okay.
Should our identities be defined by this shared history that we have, or by the potential that exists within each individual?
And that feels incredibly relevant right now,
Yeah.
as we're all trying to figure out these like complicated issues around nationalism,
Oh,
globalization, the rights of minority groups. It's a lot.
absolutely.
And honestly, it's a question that each of us has to grapple with.
It really is. And the
Yeah.
truth is, there's no simple answer.
Right.
But by really digging into these complex ideas, but by really wrestling with these big questions, it opens us up.
Yeah.
It opens us up to new possibilities, new ways of seeing things,
Right.
and maybe, just maybe, it'll help us imagine a better future.
I like that. So it seems like the real legacy of Rudolf Steiner's work, it's not necessarily about having all the answers.
Right?
It's about, sparking that conversation, getting people to think.
Yeah, he was all about challenging assumptions, getting people to think differently about the world
Yeah.
and their place in it.
Really well said. And, who knows? Maybe in the process of all that questioning and exploring,
Yeah,
maybe we actually find some common ground with each other.
that's it.
Some shared understanding that helps bridge all these divides that can make us feel so far apart.
Now, wouldn't that be something?
It really would. It would be something special. And on that note, we're going to leave you today with this final thought. So, something to kind of chew on as you're, thinking about all of this. What would a world that truly prioritizes individual freedom over group identity, what would that world actually look like?
Right.
Is it even possible?
Good question.
And if it is, how do we get there? So until next time, keep asking those big questions and keep diving deep.